1912 is a podcast about the expulsion of more than 1,000 Black residents from Forsyth County, Georgia, and its lasting impact on the families affected. For an episode guide, maps, photos, and more, visit us online at atlantahistorycenter.com. This episode contains strong language and descriptions of violence. Please take care while listening. So we just passed exit 12. We're coming up on exit 13. And this is really... A few months ago, Rose and I took a trip up to Forsyth County. The traffic here is crazy because this is like the main point to get. The county looks a lot different today than 1987, when the Brotherhood marches brought national attention and scrutiny to Forsyth.
So we're at the section of
now, Forsyth is your modern-day suburban landscape, but the events of 1912 still linger.
This last line on this marker that reads, "Like all victims of racial terror lynchings, Rob Edwards died without due process of law."
Over the past 4 episodes, we've covered 75 years of history. We've talked about myth, narrative, and the legacy of Black families expelled from Forsyth County in 1912.
We left off in 1987 with delegates from Forsyth denying any Black-owned land was illegally seized. They also denied racial intimidation was the main factor in Black residents fleeing the county. To finish this series, we want to tell you about what's going on in Forsyth today.
But before we do that, I need to tell you something I haven't told you yet. Not only did I grow up in Forsyth County, but my white Southern family was living in Forsyth in 1912.
I'm Rose Scott.
And I'm Sophia Dodd.
This is 1912.
A podcast from Atlanta History Center Originals, distributed by WABE. My great-grandmother, Rosalie, was born in 1916 in Forsyth County, Georgia. She was raised a stone's throw away from Haw Creek Baptist Church, where most of her family is still buried. In 1912, Rosalie's parents and her older siblings lived 2 doors down from a Black landowning family, Charles Houston, and his wife, who was also named Sophia. Now, I don't know if my family participated in the lynching of Rob Edwards or the expulsion of over 1,000 Black residents. Those stories were never passed down. Older generations can remember my great-grandmother talking about Forsyth County once, when she told them if a Black man came to Forsyth, he would be dead the next day. I'm telling you all this now because this is what prompted the driving force of this podcast. What were the descendants of Black families expelled in 1912 doing today? And what was Forsyth County, the place my family has lived since the 1800s, doing for them? That's why we started talking to descendants and began recording oral histories in 2023. Then, in the midst of recording for this podcast, something no one in 1912 could have expected to happen, happened.
In 2023, for the first time, Forsyth County School District's white population was below 50%. That's because Asian, Hispanic, and Black students now make up 51%.
Let's go back for a second. In the year 2000, Black and Asian residents of Forsyth County combined made up only 1% of the population. Today, Asians alone make up nearly 20% of the county, while Black residents are 5%, a far cry from 1912, when Black residents were 10% of the county population.
What's interesting is these numbers are very different from neighboring counties and the nearest major city, which would be Atlanta. In Cobb, Fulton, and Gwinnett, these are surrounding counties, Black families make up at least a quarter of the population, while Asians average around 7%. But as the urban sprawl of Atlanta grows bigger, here's the question. Why aren't more Black people moving to Forsyth County.
While tens of thousands of new residents have moved to Forsyth, racism didn't just go away. I want you to hear from my brother-in-law, Alexander Akers. He moved to Forsyth County from Cincinnati, Ohio in 1999 when he was 7 years old. His mom is white and his dad is black. When he moved to Forsyth, he and his younger brother were the only black kids in their neighborhood.
Anytime I'd come out to play, they would sing like this little song. They would say, "The KKK is getting bigger, grab a stick and hit a nigger." I didn't really understand it, because I never heard the word before. Kids would literally scream white power to me. It was tough. Very tough.
While delegates in 1987 promised the county was safe and welcoming, this wasn't the case for some who moved to Forsyth in the early 2000s.
In elementary school, nobody really wanted to play with me. Nobody really wanted to be seen with me. It was always made out like I was the bad kid. I remember something happening and I reacted, and couldn't have been the best reaction because I ended up going to the principal and then the counselor. She sat me down and said that I live here now and that the old me is gone. She walked me to the front door to wave bye to the old me, which was really weird for me. I'll never forget that. And that was in second grade. So,
as he grew older, Alexander started to see some change in the county. He was no longer the only black student in his classes.
Going into high school, the dynamic kind of changed because we had one other mixed kid and then one full black kid. And I've been there the longest, so I was just like, I got to stop. I can't keep letting people say these things and walk all over me and stuff. So kind of gotten to where I was getting into fights a lot due to racist remarks.
The taunting and bullying only stopped when a 16-year-old Alexander moved out of Forsyth in 2008.
And I can attest, even in 2008, hostility towards black people still existed amongst some whites in the county. That same year, a man yelled no N-words at my friends and I when we were getting off the school bus one afternoon. He was yelling at the only black girl who lived in our neighborhood. We were 8 years old. These kinds of comments weren't out of the norm when I was growing up, and in school, I never learned about the history of the county or the events of 1912. I didn't even know slavery existed in Forsyth. Instead, when I was in 8th grade, my history teacher made us debate slavery, and then named the pro-slavery team the winners. I don't tell you these stories to make you hate Forsyth County, because I don't. Forsyth is home to me, and it's a place I love. But it doesn't change that Alexander and I carry these experiences with us.
I didn't have anybody to aspire to be like. There was no elderly black people, no kids even, so I didn't have anybody to point towards, to grow up like, that was of color, of any color in my area.
Today, Alexander is a proud father of 6, and he's made a great life for himself and his family. But for both of us, not knowing the history of 1912 left a huge gap.
So to know now that there were blacks in Forsyth is like mind-blowing to me, and I would love, I have no relation to them, but I would love to meet them because it's like a hero to the story.
Today, local groups are working to change Forsyth. They want the county to be a more welcoming place. One of these groups is the Forsyth Descendants Scholarship, which awards funds to descendants of black residents forced out of the county in 1912. Here's Durwood Sneed. He's a retired pastor and founder of the scholarship. He moved to Forsyth in 1988.
I didn't know anything about black ownership of land until the last few years. And it wasn't until I read Patrick Phillips' book, Blood at the Root, that there were 50-some owners of land in the county, some of whom owned as much as 200 acres, then lost that land and were not able to participate in the growth of wealth, in the county, or to pass that down to their descendants.
For Durwood, it brought up one question: what can we do for descendants today?
I got together with several other pastors in the county, and we began talking, and we said, we feel like we need to do something that could be helpful to these families that have suffered so much, and hopefully something that can be a positive thing that can help the next generation to overcome maybe a little bit of the pain and the loss that has been there in the past, and hopefully set them on a path to success for the future. So this idea of a college scholarship for descendants of those people that were expelled from the county in 1912 arose.
Pastors across the county were on board. They too felt Black families expelled in 1912 deserved to be honored and remembered. More than 100 years after Black residents were forced out of their homes, their belongings burned, and their churches destroyed, it only seemed right pastors today would lead the effort to bring some relief to descendants.
Although Durwood's family moved to Forsyth in the 80s and had no connection to what happened in 1912, he still feels it's an important initiative for people living in Forsyth now.
One person asked me one day, they said, "So do you feel guilty?" I said, "No, I don't feel guilty because I wasn't here. I didn't do it. It wasn't even my family that was part of this." I said, "I feel very ashamed of what happened in this land, this county that I love and the county I live in. And I feel great compassion for the people that were affected then and the people that are affected now by what happened." And it's those two emotions, I think, that really have driven me to feel that I need to do something, and I can't just sit idly by.
But Durwood and the Scholarship Fund acknowledge the scholarship is only a start. There's more to be done.
This is not fixing anything. It's not justice. It's not a reckoning. It's just something positive, and we think it's better to do something than to do nothing. And it's not enough. But hopefully it's a start.
Many of the descendants we interviewed have family members who were awarded the scholarship. They agree with Durwood. It's a good start, but descendants believe justice must come from the Forsyth County government.
But remember, in 1987, delegates representing Forsyth denied any Black-owned land was illegally seized during the 1912 racial expulsion. They also denied racial violence was the main reason Black residents fled the county. That's the last time descendants were given any formal statement on what happened in 1912.
Elon Osby, the granddaughter of William Bagley, who was forced to leave 60 acres in Forsyth, has lived to see her own grandchildren awarded the Descendants Scholarship.
It's such a beautiful thing, the scholarship fund. That money for those scholarships is not coming from Forsyth County government. Forsyth County government, the city of Cumming, and the state of Georgia, that's where reparations collectively has to come from, because they all were involved. They all allowed it to happen. And when they do something, then I think that I can sit back and say, okay, all right, we're good.
For Edith Lester, whose great-grandfather Jim Strickland owned 80 acres in Forsyth, one of the ways the county can make amends is to give a portion of property tax revenue back to descendants.
The county is getting taxes for that money. For that land. So I think they should be responsible for paying the restitution on it. That's only fair.
But as of the recording of this podcast, there is no government-sponsored program or formal acknowledgement of the 1912 racial expulsion. For descendants, it seems only private citizens are trying to make a difference.
But these are people who have moved to Forsyth County, and that's who's changing it. That's who's creating the new Forsyth County. And I go up there often. I've been up there so many times. I was their keynote speaker for the dedication of the plaque where Rob Edwards was lynched.
The marker was placed in 2021. It was another effort by private citizens who are part of the Community Remembrance Project. The group works with the Equal Justice Initiative to honor victims of lynchings in the United States.
Another group, Leadership Forsyth, preserved the former Colored Methodist Episcopal Church cemetery. The cemetery is on government-owned property at the local recycling center, and the Forsyth County government gave them permission to restore the gravesite.
But there are many Black grave sites in Forsyth County, and descendants want officials to help preserve those too. This includes descendants of Jim Strickland. For many years, their family cemetery in Forsyth was used as a trash site by locals. Recently, it's been kept up by Boy Scouts.
My grandmother used to tell us all about the old homestead that was up in Forsyth County.
This preservation issue was first brought up by descendants of Jim Strickland in 2007 when they took part in a documentary called Banish.
Oh, you think about the land every once in a while?
The land?
The land up where the...
I'll always think about it.
The film explored different locations in the U.S. where Black communities were expelled. The crew of Banish wanted to film the cemetery, so one of Jim's descendants, Charlie Wiley, went to look for it.
I went and found it, went there ahead of everybody. The first time I went there, I don't know how these people had word somehow that maybe we were looking for it. And when I walked on the property, he said, well, it's right here. And then it had old tin roof pieces laying across it, old tires laying up against the trees in the area where the headstones were, some barbed wire, grass very high, and just old stones, cinder blocks, building blocks just thrown over. And as I walked up, he started trying to pull some of the stuff away. He said, yeah, we heard somebody was looking for it, and he was pulling the things away. It was a trash site, basically, where they throw their old items that they didn't want to keep in the front of the house. But they knew that it was that graveyard. They just disrespected it until they realized that somebody cares and they're coming to see it. By the time we got back the second time, they had kind of cleaned away the tin and the old tires and the old cinder blocks. So they tried to make it a lot more presentable when we went back with the camera.
The Historical Society of Cumming Forsyth County has records of all the cemeteries in Forsyth, Black and white. They've worked to try to keep them clean, but some property owners in the county are not too keen on this. Martha McConnell.
We've put up crosses on graves, and then people come back and say, take them down. I don't want people to know I live by a cemetery.
Cemeteries are one of the last physical reminders of Black residents expelled in 1912. But this issue of neglected resting places goes beyond Forsyth.
I felt like not on my watch. Somebody's forcing my family out, first out of Forsyth County, then out of Bagley Park, and now you want to remove them from the cemetery.
That after the break. Let's revisit the story of William Bagley, forced from 60 acres of his own land in Forsyth County. He went on to establish Bagley Park in Buckhead, and again, this is Atlanta's most affluent neighborhood. Members of the Bagley family and those who lived in Bagley Park were buried at Mount Olive Cemetery, which was at the front of the neighborhood. In the 1950s, Fulton County destroyed Bagley Park using eminent domain. They built a public park and baseball fields on top of the neighborhood, but they left the cemetery intact.
In the decades following, the cemetery fell into severe disrepair, but legally, it was still a public, non-taxable lot. However, Fulton County began incorrectly taxing the property. Because these taxes went unpaid, Fulton County sold the lot to a property developer.
The developer planned to remove the graves, but the Buckhead Heritage Society wanted to preserve the cemetery. They contacted William Bagley's granddaughter, Elon Osby, to put a stop to the removal. One of its members, Wright Mitchell, filed a lawsuit with Elon against the developer.
I felt like not on my watch. this is getting to be a habit. Somebody's forcing my family out, first out of Forsyth County, then out of Bagley Park, and now you want to remove them from the cemetery. And I just couldn't let that happen. And so the lawsuit went forward. We won. And I want to mention we won on the basis that Mount Olive Cemetery was ruled a public cemetery, not a private cemetery. And that's how we won.
The city of Atlanta made Buckhead Heritage the official caretakers of the cemetery. In 2022, Elon and Buckhead Heritage lobbied to reinstate Bagley Park as the official name. Within a couple of months, the city of Atlanta unanimously voted to change the name to Historic Bagley Park. This was at Elon's request.
As of the recording of this podcast, Alon Osby is working closely with the Fulton County Reparations Task Force. They're investigating reparations solutions for Fulton's Black population. This is the kind of action Alon wants to see from Forsyth County, too.
The story of 1912 and what happened to Black families afterwards is part of a cycle of trauma, one which compounds and carries across generations. For Monica Goins, a researcher at Clark Atlanta University, any tangible effort to make amends with descendants has to include this fact.
When we talk about land loss and displacement currently, it is centered around economic impact. However, I want white society to understand that every little threat that has been placed upon Black people creates a larger impact outside of that can be fixed with just a check. I'm hoping that that will somehow change the outlook of reparations, because that is a tense topic. It's a heavy word that incites, discomfort and rage sometimes from different communities. But if we can make the conversation go beyond money and wealth, hopefully that will render a more positive result.
For descendants, it's not just about the land or the wealth. It's about the emotional and psychological impact this event created throughout generations. More than 100 years later, the events of 1912 still hurt. And part of this hurt is because of the lack of acknowledgement. Sabin Strickland is a descendant of Jim Strickland and the lead pastor of Pleasant Hill Church in Roswell, Georgia.
When you think about generational wealth and all of that, that's connected to land, the one thing that folks aren't making any more of, land, right? But at one time, my family was talking to the county of Forsyth just about this kind of thing. And of course, the initial response was, well, that wasn't us, that wasn't our families, but man, you see these homes that are sitting there and how the county has benefited from the land with no acknowledgement to those of whom the land was taken from. Then taking the next step and saying not only was a wrong done, but this is the kind of wrong that was done. We not only displaced people from their land and that kind of thing and the place where they live and thrive, but we took advantage of them on the way out too.
For the Merritt family, whose ancestors fled Forsyth in 1912, they want this history out there for future generations. Candace Merritt Jones.
It needs to be taught. It's part of history. Regardless how it hurts, it happened. You can't say it didn't happen. I would like to do a memorial of the families that were forced to leave. I would like to see that. Let them know we were here. We're not going to be forgotten.
This also means breaking the generational code of silence. Elon Osby believes for any action to happen, descendants have to come together, united.
The fear that remains about this, and it's clearly still there, passed on from generation to generation. One thing that I have been concerned about is that when I go to these different events or different meetings, there's the same 2 or 3 descendants of Forsyth County African-American families. And I have actually talked to some people and asked them, why you didn't come to this meeting or, to that event or whatever. And it was actually expressed to me, we're just not ready for that. Without them actually saying it, you pick up the feeling that they're still afraid. I know that there are more descendants. I know they're somewhere. And I think that we have to come out and we have to tell the story so that it won't happen again. And I don't know how we get past the fear.
For Durwood Sneed of the Forsyth Descendants Scholarship, he believes telling the history of 1912 will bring healing.
We're hoping that our county becomes a redemption story so that there's the past that was just awful and ugly and evil. And we're hoping that the county that Oprah Winfrey called the most racist county in America in 1987 can now be an example of one of the most open, reconciled, and welcoming counties in the nation very soon.
Patrick Phillips published Blood at the Root in 2016, and nearly a decade later, he too hopes continued research and awareness can push Forsyth to be a leader for the rest of the world to look to.
I love Forsyth County. I grew up there. It's still home. So these things are complicated and difficult, and in some ways, my point is not to tell anyone that it's not complicated, but that this childlike fantasy that if you stop talking about it, it will all get better, that has to end. We have to put that away. I think telling the story and knowing the facts and putting names and dates and places to it is a kind of necessary precondition for whatever comes next, because all of that was short-circuited. All through my childhood, any of that discussion was short-circuited by people saying, well, that's not true. That didn't happen. But Forsyth County happens to have tremendous means. And I think the way forward would be to be a leader, to become known nationally as this groundbreaking effort that would try to use all of that wealth that's been generated there to try to make some of these families, if not whole, at least so that they would get something from all of this.
For the youngest descendants, who are now 3 and even 4 generations from being forced out of Forsyth County, keeping their families' stories alive is the key to moving towards justice. And this is where organizations like the Forsyth Descendants Scholarship are working to preserve this history. In order to apply, descendants must write an essay about their family. So as this series comes to a close, we want to end with the voice of Chase Evans, one of the first descendants we talked to. He was awarded the Forsyth Descendants Scholarship as he entered his final year of college. One can only imagine how his ancestors may have felt, seeing Chase back in Forsyth County on a warm Saturday in August. He read his essay on the stage of Brownsbridge Church, just a few miles from Oscarville, where Rob Edwards, Ernest Knox, Oscar Daniel, and Jane Daniel were first accused. The crowd was full of descendants, some from Black families forced out of Forsyth in 1912, and some from white families who lived in the county during the expulsion. But all were there in honor of the 1,117 Black men, women, and children who once called Forsyth County home.
My Scholarship Essay by Chase Evans. My great-grandma was expelled from Forsyth County when she was only 3 years old. She was the 8th of 11 children and the last to truly not be an infant when this injustice occurred. She grew up distinctly molded by these experiences that immediately followed my family's expulsion. Yet she went on to get an education through 8th grade but possessed much more wisdom than her education allotted her. She married during the Depression and lived in little more than a barn-made home, bartering butter to make the ends meet to support her 5 children and their educations. By no means were her efforts in vain. She and her husband went on to buy a house in Smyrna and then some, and her children went on to become teachers, pastors, and musicians. Over 100 years have passed, and my bloodline is finally beginning to shake off the shackles of disparity that were placed upon us by society, our finances, and even ourselves. The weight of the world is great and not fairly put upon everyone equally, but it is not only the duty but the sincere will of good men among us to raise that weight so that others can move about easier, to be a pillar among mankind and a warrior against the brutalities of inequity. She was such a person, a pillar to her family, her faith, and her community. I had the privilege to know her in life. Only now have I begun to comprehend it all. It is for this reason that one of my true regrets in life was never having the opportunity to thank her, to tell her I was finally old enough to understand, that I was old enough to listen. Time, as it turns out, is truly the great equalizer, and sometimes there's just never enough time to tell the people you love the things you wish you could before their time here ends. Even though I may not be able to say the words to her, I know the greatest thanks I can give is to utilize the opportunities she gave my family and go forward in this life with that will to carry on that she had. And in every endeavor I pursue, to remember how truly strong the cloth was that I was cut from.
Y'all remember that? Let your light shine, shine, shine. There may be somebody down in the valley trying to get home. Y'all, I grew up on that kind of stuff. Let your light shine, shine, shine. Let your light shine, shine, shine. There may be somebody down in the valley trying to get home. There may be somebody down in the valley. Yeah, there might be somebody down in the valley. There may be somebody down in the valley trying to get home.
"1912" is a production of Atlanta History Center Originals. Christian Weatherspoon is our executive producer. Sophia Dodd and Samantha Young are our producers. Episodes were written and researched by Sophia Dodd. Our show is edited by Mike Voulgaris with Samantha Young and Michael Peterbon. Content support by Tiffany Hart. Additional support provided by Paula Shagnon, Atlanta History Center marketing team, and Atlanta History Center staff. Studio and field recording by Michael Peterbon and Linda Spears. Music is from Blue Dot Sessions and Epidemic Sound. A special thank you to Pastor Sabin Strickland from Pleasant Hill Church in Roswell, Georgia, who you heard singing at the end of this episode. A special thank you to descendants and participants of this podcast who share their time and stories with us. Visit us in person at Atlanta History Center to see descendant photos and family histories, which are on display through 2025 and can also be seen on our website, atlantahistorycenter.com. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Atlanta History Center, and on YouTube at Atlanta History. 1912 is distributed by WABE. Listen at wabe.org/1912 or any place you find podcasts.